Some lies are buried so deep that they survive wars, laws, and generations. They hide in basements, in dust, in ink that no one thinks to question. And sometimes the only reason they are discovered is because the wrong person asked the right question. In March of 1951, Margaret Hayes walked into the basement of the Charleston County Records Office thinking she had found safety. What she actually found was proof of a crime so monstrous that it had rewritten hundreds of lives. The basement smelled like damp paper and mold. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and followed you home. Rows of tall metal filing cabinets stretched across the room, their surfaces dull with age, their drawers heavy with forgotten history. Overhead, fluorescent lights flickered like they were tired of revealing secrets. Margaret set her purse down on an old wooden desk scarred by decades of use. She rolled up the sleeves of her blouse and took a breath. This was her new life. Chief Archivist of Charleston County. The job sounded simple when County Administrator Howard Brennan explained it. Organize decades of records. Create order. Clean up mistakes left behind by the previous archivist, Mr. Thornton, who had retired after 32 years. Margaret needed simple. After her father died, medical bills swallowed her savings. Budget cuts had ended her job at the Columbia Municipal Library. Charleston was supposed to be a fresh start. Quiet work. Honest work. She pulled her first ledger from the shelf. A heavy leather-bound book from 1927. Dust puffed into the air as she opened it. Inside were birth records written in neat handwriting. Names, dates, times, parents, race. She flipped pages carefully, making notes. Everything looked normal until it did not. One entry stopped her cold. Female infant, European descent, mother blank, father blank, place of birth Charleston Foundling Home. Adopted within 3 days. Margaret frowned. Foundling homes usually had at least some information. Abandoned at church steps. Mother wishes anonymity. Something. She turned the page. Male infant, European descent. No parents listed. Born at Charleston Foundling Home. Adopted within 48 hours. Another page. Another baby. Same pattern. All listed as white. All with no parents. All adopted quickly. All placed with wealthy families. Battery Street. South Battery. The best addresses in Charleston. Margaret lit a cigarette and leaned back in her chair. She had worked with records for years. Errors happened. But this was too clean. Too empty. She kept digging. Days turned into weeks. Every morning she arrived before sunrise. Coffee in one hand, cigarettes in the other. By noon the ashtray was full and her notepad crowded with names. Between 1923 and 1939 she counted 147 babies that fit the same description. No parents. White. Adopted fast. Wealthy families. That alone was unsettling. But what changed everything was the hospital records. Charleston County Hospital kept detailed admission logs. Margaret had been boxing them by year when something caught her eye. A woman admitted for childbirth. Delivered a baby. Discharged without child. That happened sometimes. Stillbirths. Infant deaths. But then she noticed the dates. She spread documents across her desk one afternoon after sending her assistant home early. Birth certificate. Baby Catherine. European. No parents. Born March 14, 1931. Adopted 3 days later. Hospital admission. Evelyn Porter. Negro. Age 24. Admitted March 14, 1931. Delivered a girl at 3:47 in the morning. Discharged without child. Same date. Same hospital. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She pulled another file. Baby James. European. No parents. Born August 3, 1928. Hospital record. Ruth Ann Jackson. Negro. Age 19. Delivered a boy August 3 at 11:23 at night. Discharged without child. Same doctor. Dr. Harrison Webb. Margaret's hands shook as she lit another cigarette. She worked until the building emptied and the sky outside turned black. By nightfall she had 17 matches. 17 babies with no mothers. 17 mothers with no babies. Every mother was black. Every baby was listed as white. Every case involved the same doctor. This was not a mistake. This was a system. Someone had been stealing babies from black women and selling them into white families. Erasing their origins. changing their race on paper, turning human lives into transactions. Margaret stared at the files spread before her like a crime scene frozen in time. The weight of it pressed on her chest. These crimes were decades old, but the people involved were likely still alive. Powerful, respected. She thought of Dr. Webb, a man whose name appeared on hundreds of medical records. A man trusted with life. She thought of the adoptive families, old Charleston names, influence, money, and she thought of the mothers who went home with empty arms and no explanation. She should report this immediately, but deep down, Margaret knew something else. This was too big to be ignored for 30 years by accident. Someone had wanted these files buried, and now she was standing in the middle of them. She closed the ledger slowly, her heart pounding. Tomorrow she would decide what to do. Tonight she locked the files back in their cabinets and turned off the light. She did not know yet that the moment she discovered the truth, she became part of the story. And that the records were not done with her. If this story pulled you in, make sure you subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 2 reveals what happened when Margaret tried to speak up and why some doors in Charleston were never meant to be opened. Part 2 The door that never opened. Every crime leaves fingerprints. Some are on weapons, some are on bodies, and some are pressed quietly into paper, ink, and silence. Margaret Hayes was beginning to understand that the most dangerous crimes were the ones protected by politeness. By the second week of May 1951, she knew the truth could not belong to one man alone. What she had uncovered required coordination. Hospital staff, clerks, adoption agencies, county offices, people who knew exactly when to look away and when to sign their names. This was not chaos. This was a machine. Dr. Harrison Webb's name sat at the center of it. Margaret had seen it everywhere. Hospital admission logs, birth records, medical reports, always written with confidence, never abbreviated, never missing. Webb was not just a doctor. He was an institution. Old newspapers spoke of him as a pillar of Charleston. He had spoken at charity events. He had cut ribbons at hospital expansions. His name appeared on plaques Margaret had dusted while cataloging old storage rooms. He was trusted, respected, untouchable, and every stolen child led back to him. Margaret knew she could not walk into her supervisor's office with suspicion alone. Powerful people dismissed suspicion easily. She needed proof that could not be explained away. Proof that would survive denial. So she kept digging. She began working longer hours, but carefully. Not too carefully, just enough to look dedicated. Betty noticed, of course. She mentioned one afternoon that Mrs. Hayes worked harder than anyone she had ever seen. Mr. Brennan seemed pleased. On his weekly check-ins, he praised her progress and attention to detail. Margaret smiled and thanked him, all while keeping her real work locked in the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside that drawer was a secret system. For every matched case, Margaret wrote a full profile. The mother's name, her address, her age, the baby's listed race, the adoptive family, their address, their social standing, the attending doctor, the dates. Patterns began to form. Certain neighborhoods appeared again and again. Certain surnames repeated. Certain families adopted multiple children through the same agencies, years apart, always under the same circumstances. Margaret began drawing lines between names on loose sheets of paper. She folded them small and kept them hidden in her purse. It felt less like research and more like mapping a conspiracy. One evening after work, she drove past the old Charleston foundling home. The building no longer held crying infants. It had been turned into apartments. People lived there now, cooked dinners, raised families, slept peacefully. A small plaque near the door marked its former purpose. Margaret parked across the street and stared at it through her windshield. She imagined frightened young women stepping through those doors. Women told they were doing the right thing. Women told their babies would be cared for. She wondered how many were told their child had died. Street. Catherine's Adoption Society bothered her more. It was still open, still active, still respected. That was where Margaret decided to go next. On a Saturday morning in early May, she dressed carefully. Navy blue dress, white collar, modest shoes, A hat that made her look respectable and harmless. She practiced her story in the mirror until it felt natural. The building on King Street looked warm and professional. Clean floors, bright walls, framed photographs of smiling children lined the hallway. Behind the reception desk sat a woman with perfect posture and steel gray hair. Her nameplate read Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, Administrative Director. Margaret felt a chill she could not explain. She introduced herself gently and asked about an adoption from 1932. A cousin, an inheritance, a reasonable request. Mrs. Pritchard's smile appeared instantly, polite, professional, but empty. Margaret watched her closely as she said the name Cunningham. For just a fraction of a second, something crossed Mrs. Pritchard's face. Recognition, caution, memory. Then the wall came down. Records were confidential. State law. No confirmation. No denial. No assistance. Mrs. Pritchard closed the ledger without opening it. That told Margaret everything. This woman did not need to check the records. She already knew. When Margaret pressed gently, explaining the inheritance, the response hardened. Procedures. Court orders. Rules. A conversation practiced many times before. Mrs. Pritchard stood, signaling the end. Margaret left with a smile on her face and dread in her stomach. That building was not a charity. It was a gatekeeper. Someone had trained Mrs. Pritchard to stop questions like this quickly and quietly. Someone had protected these records for decades. Back at the office, Margaret became cautious. She changed her routine. Sometimes she arrived early, sometimes late, sometimes she left exactly at 5. She did not want anyone to notice patterns. She created a second set of notes at home, hidden in a hatbox at the back of her closet. If her desk was searched, if files disappeared, she would still have her evidence. And then something else began to happen. Small things at first. A file she knew she had placed on her desk appeared back in its cabinet. A drawer left slightly open when she was certain she had locked it. The feeling that someone had been in the records room after hours. One afternoon she found her hidden drawer unlocked. Nothing was missing, but the lock had been turned. It was a message. Someone was watching. Margaret did not sleep well that night. She lay awake listening to every sound in her apartment building. Footsteps, doors, the hum of traffic outside. The next morning, she found a note waiting on her desk. No signature, just 5 words. Be careful what you catalog. Her hands shook as she folded the paper and slipped it into her purse. This was no longer just history. This was danger. Someone knew she was close. Someone knew she was asking the wrong questions. And someone was reminding her that powerful people did not like being exposed. But Margaret Hayes had already crossed a line she could not step back from. The truth was real. The mothers were real. The stolen children were real. And she was not going to stop. If this story has you hooked, make sure you subscribe to the channel, share this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 3 reveals the first attempt to silence Margaret and the name that finally made her blood run cold. Part 3 The cry that echoed. Some sounds stay with you forever. A scream, a whisper, a baby's cry. Margaret Hayes had never heard the last one so clearly, yet she could feel it in her chest as if it had traveled through time. By mid-June of 1951, Margaret's quiet investigation into Charleston's forgotten records had become a storm in her mind. She had uncovered hundreds of babies with no mothers listed. Hundreds of mothers who were told their children had died. Hundreds of babies placed in wealthy homes as white children, their origins erased from history. And now she knew it was no accident. It was deliberate, organized, efficient, ruthless. She had always worked alone, with nothing but ledgers and pens. But to truly understand, to confirm the horror of her suspicions, she needed people who had lived it. Mothers who remembered, people who had survived, people who knew the truth. Evelyn Porter's name had appeared on multiple documents. A Negro woman admitted to Charleston County Hospital in March of 1931. Delivered a daughter. Discharged without child. Margaret had already verified that the hospital's paperwork matched a European infant adopted by the Cunningham family. Baby Catherine. The dates were exact. The names were not. Now, sitting across from Evelyn's brother on the sagging porch of a house on Cumming Street, Margaret realized this investigation was more than history. It was human, real, painful, undeniable. The man's face was lined with years and sorrow. He spoke slowly, as if weighing each word before letting it leave his mouth. My sister Evelyn went into that hospital 9 months pregnant. She wasn't married. The father of her child worked at the port. A white man. Denied everything. Evelyn didn't care. She was happy to have the baby anyway. He paused, shaking his head. She had names picked out. Clothes ready. Plans. Margaret nodded, leaning slightly forward. Did she expect something different when she went to the hospital? Yes. She expected to go home with her daughter, he said, voice tight. They told her the baby died. Complications, they said. Better this way. The Lord works in mysterious ways, they said. Did she believe them? Margaret asked quietly. He laughed bitterly. What choice did she have? They were white doctors. She was a black woman, poor, unmarried. When she asked to see the body, they said it wasn't possible. Said the baby was already prepared for burial. Said it would be too upsetting, better to remember the pregnancy instead of seeing death. He paused again. The afternoon wind lifted the scent of tomatoes and dried earth from the garden. But she didn't believe them, he said finally. She told me, after many nights, when the memories got too heavy, that she heard her baby crying. Just for a few seconds. Then a nurse took the child. Evelyn never saw her again. They said she imagined it. That she was confused from the pain medication. But dead babies don't cry, Miss Hayes. Margaret's hands shook. Her notebook trembled slightly in her lap. She had seen it on paper. Now she was hearing it in voice. Real, human, devastating. Do you know what they called her? He asked softly. The baby. Not by Evelyn, not by us. By the hospital and the papers. No, Margaret said. Catherine Cunningham, he said. They named her for the family who bought her. Margaret swallowed hard. The scale of it, the deliberate cruelty, pressed against her chest like a weight. She had thought about the hospitals, the ledgers, the adoption papers. She had considered money trails, public respectability, and the ease of falsifying documents. But she had not felt it. She had not imagined the lives fractured, the mothers lied to, the children stolen into wealth that wasn't theirs. She asked another question, careful, respectful, as a white woman entering decades of black grief. Do you know if anyone else went through something like this? The man looked at her, expression hardening. Many. Evelyn was not the only one. Not even close. Families all through Charleston. Poor women. Black women. Children taken and given to rich white families. Papers changed. Birth certificates forged. People trusted the doctors, the agencies, the churches. No one believed the mothers. And if they did, what could they do? Nothing. Margaret's mind raced. 207 cases and counting. Babies removed from mothers, recorded as white, adopted through trusted channels. Payments flowing from hospitals and families to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau. And Webb. Dr. Harrison Webb. His name on every hospital record. His hands on every transaction. His reputation untouched. Revered. Celebrated. Praised for work that was a mask for years of systematic abuse. Margaret asked carefully, do you know why this happened? Why the babies were taken? The man leaned back in his rocking chair, squinting at the sun. They wanted light-skinned children. The families wanted white babies. The law, the society, the hospitals, they all helped. No one checked. No one cared. And those babies, they were never meant to belong to the mothers. Just to the families with money. Margaret felt bile rise. Not only had the babies been stolen, but a whole system of power and privilege had ensured they could never be traced back. A legal, social, and medical conspiracy wrapped in respectability. She knew she had to keep records of this. Every word mattered. Every detail was evidence. But she also knew she had to be careful. She had already received warnings. Her files had been tampered with. A note left on her desk. Someone was watching. Margaret decided to continue her work, cautiously, and to expand her interviews to others she could identify from the hospital records. Mothers, neighbors, midwives who might remember. She also realized she needed to consider the families. The adoptive families. Many were still alive, wealthy, powerful, connected to the same networks. Some could hurt her if they realized what she was uncovering. As she left Cumming Street that afternoon, Margaret felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She had begun as an archivist, cataloging old records. Now she was an investigator, a witness, a keeper of truths that powerful people wanted buried. She glanced down at the notebook in her lap. Pages filled with dates, names, addresses, and observations. Each one a testament, each one a thread in a web that stretched across decades, connecting mothers who had been silenced and children who had been stolen. Margaret drove home slowly, keeping to side streets to avoid drawing attention. She knew the work ahead was dangerous. She knew the city's elite would not welcome her questions. And she knew, in the back of her mind, that the story she was piecing together could destroy lives, her own included. But she also knew the truth was too important to ignore. The babies who had been taken deserved to be remembered. The mothers who had been silenced deserved to be heard. And history deserved to know what really happened in Charleston. If this story has gripped you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 4 reveals the first serious threat to Margaret's safety and the chilling network of people still protecting the secrets she is uncovering. If you want, I can continue now and create Part 4, where Margaret faces real danger for the first time, escalating the tension and horror. Do you want me to proceed with that? Part 4 The Shadow in the Office. Some secrets fight back. Some truths are dangerous not because they are hard to find but because they threaten people who will go to any lengths to protect themselves. Margaret Hayes was about to learn that firsthand. By the end of June 1951, Margaret's investigation had grown far beyond the dusty ledgers of Charleston County. She had tracked hundreds of babies, traced financial records showing payments to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, and spoken to at least one surviving relative of a mother whose child had been stolen. She knew now that the operation had been deliberate, coordinated, protected by wealth, power, and respectability. But she also knew someone was watching her. Someone had already tampered with her files. A note had appeared on her desk. Someone had warned her to be careful. That morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual, carrying a stack of hospital admission records. The fluorescent lights flickered as she descended into the basement. It was empty and quiet, just as it had always been before dawn. But today the air felt heavier. Margaret shook off the feeling. She had work to do. Patterns to trace. Connections to document. She needed to focus. She was cataloging adoptions from the mid-1930s when she noticed something unusual. A file she had left on the desk the night before was no longer where she remembered putting it. She froze. Someone had been in the basement after hours. Margaret closed her eyes and counted to 10. She told herself it was just a mistake. The cabinet drawers sometimes slid on their old tracks. But her instincts told her otherwise. She returned the file to the desk and continued working, pretending nothing had happened. She was methodical. She had to be. Every case was a story. Every ledger, every piece of paper, was a witness. By mid-morning, Margaret had made a breakthrough. The adoptions, hospital admissions, and payments all pointed to a pattern she hadn't fully realized before. Certain families had multiple children placed through St. Catherine's Adoption Society. Certain neighborhoods and churches repeatedly appeared in her research. Certain doctors, nurses, and social workers were listed again and again. And at the center of it all was Dr. Harrison Webb, long dead, revered, untouchable. Margaret's hands shook as she wrote down another connection. She knew she was getting close to something powerful. Something dangerous. Later that afternoon, as she stepped out for lunch, she felt a pair of eyes on her. A man in a gray suit stood across the street, leaning against a lamppost, watching. Margaret ducked behind a parked car, heart pounding. She watched him through the corner of her eye until he disappeared around the corner. She returned to the office, forcing herself to calm down. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a coincidence. But the warning from before, the tampered files, the note, they were no coincidences. Someone was monitoring her. By evening, Margaret had finished organizing her day's discoveries. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted. The office was empty. She lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl toward the flickering fluorescent light. The phone rang. She jumped. The line was dead, silent except for faint static. Margaret set the receiver down. Her pulse quickened. Someone had called. Someone had been listening. She returned to her desk and noticed the top drawer of her desk slightly ajar. Her hidden notes were safe, but the drawer had been disturbed. She closed it carefully and locked it again. She realized that whoever was following her knew she was uncovering more than she had realized. Margaret thought of Evelyn Porter. Of the mothers who had been silenced. Of the babies who had been stolen. And she made a decision. She would not stop. She could not stop. The next day, Margaret received an envelope at her office. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. Written in careful, elegant handwriting were 3 words: "Stop asking questions." Her stomach turned. Her mind raced. She had suspected danger. She had imagined warnings. But now it was direct. Clear. Personal. Someone wanted her to quit. To go home. To forget everything. Margaret stared at the note for several minutes. Then she picked up her pen and wrote in her notepad. She would continue. She had to continue. She owed it to the mothers, the children, and the truth. That evening, she drove past St. Catherine's Adoption Society again. The building seemed unchanged, polished, professional, safe. Margaret imagined the hidden offices, the files, the people who worked quietly to make sure no one questioned the adoptions. She shivered. She remembered what Evelyn Porter's brother had told her. Dead babies don't cry. But these babies had not died. They had been stolen, and someone had been protecting the secret for decades. Margaret began compiling a plan. She would continue documenting every adoption, every hospital record, every payment. She would not go into neighborhoods alone without careful preparation. She would not reveal her work to anyone she could not trust. She would back up her files in multiple locations. And she would prepare for the possibility that someone might try to stop her physically. By the following week, Margaret noticed subtle changes in her office environment. A stapler moved from its usual spot. A chair slightly shifted. A pencil knocked to the floor. Small things that could be explained by fatigue or drafts. But Margaret knew better. Someone was trying to intimidate her. To unsettle her. She called Betty, who came in for a few hours to help with filing. Margaret kept the work superficial. She could not risk anyone else knowing what she had discovered. Betty never noticed the tension, never questioned why Margaret had become so secretive. That weekend, Margaret spent hours at home mapping the connections between families, hospitals, and agencies. She realized that the reach of the operation extended beyond Charleston. She suspected some babies had been placed in other cities, possibly other states. Margaret knew that uncovering this network could destroy reputations, reveal crimes, and rewrite history. But she also knew that if she did not do it, the truth would remain buried forever. Late one evening, as she sat by the window looking over the dark streets of Charleston, Margaret heard a faint knock at her door. She froze. No one should be there. She did not answer immediately. Another knock, louder this time. Margaret grabbed her coat and purse. She peeked through the peephole. No one. She opened the door carefully. The hallway was empty. On the doorstep, a small envelope lay. She picked it up with trembling hands. Inside was another note, typed this time: "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. The words were a warning, a threat. But they only strengthened her resolve. She would continue. She would document every connection. She would speak to every mother she could find. She would expose the truth, no matter the cost. Margaret Hayes was no longer just an archivist. She was a keeper of truths. A witness to crimes decades old. And the shadows that followed her were proof that she was getting closer to the heart of something powerful. The quiet basement of the Charleston County Records Office had become a battlefield. Every ledger, every hospital record, every adoption certificate was a weapon. And Margaret had learned how to wield them. If this story has gripped you, make sure you subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 5 reveals the first serious confrontation Margaret faces and the shocking lengths someone will go to protect the stolen children and the families who took them. If you want, I can continue immediately with Part 5, where Margaret faces a direct threat and begins uncovering evidence that could destroy powerful Charleston families, escalating the tension even further. Do you want me to continue? Part 5: The Visitor in the Night. Some nights feel heavier than others. Some nights carry a weight you can almost touch. That night in late June 1951, Margaret Hayes knew something had shifted. The air in her apartment was thick. The shadows cast by the streetlight outside her window moved like living things. And she was not alone. For weeks, she had sensed it. The tampered files, the notes, the man on the street corner, the footsteps behind her as she left the office. Now it was here, inside the walls of her own home. Margaret had been organizing documents from 1936 to 1938, cross-referencing birth records, hospital admissions, and adoption files. She had noted 207 babies with missing mothers. Every adoption she traced led to wealthy white families in Charleston who seemed to have connections through business, church, or social clubs. Every hospital record listed Drive Harrison Webb as the attending physician. Every payment for adoption facilitation flowed through the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, Webb's secret organization. Her pen hovered over a ledger. The numbers and names blurred as she tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. She had worked alone for months, methodical, careful, and obsessed. Now the obsession had become dangerous. A knock at her door startled her. It was soft at first, almost tentative. Margaret froze. Who would be at her door this late? She did not expect anyone. She did not trust anyone. Another knock, louder this time. She crept to the door, pressing her ear against it. No voice. Just the sound of someone standing outside, waiting. Margaret's mind raced. Should she call the police? But who would believe her? She was a white woman investigating black mothers and the most powerful families in Charleston. Anyone could accuse her of lying. Anyone could make her look crazy. She opened the door a crack. Shadows. A tall man in a dark suit, hat pulled low. His face was partially hidden. He said only one thing. Mrs. Hayes, stop asking questions. No explanation. No threat. Just those 4 words. The tone carried authority. Authority backed by power. Authority that Margaret had already seen protect hundreds of stolen children. Margaret did not respond. She closed the door slowly and locked it. Her heart pounded. The visitor was gone, but the warning stayed. The next day at the office, Margaret's nerves were taut. She tried to focus, pretending everything was normal, but her hands shook as she handled ledgers. Every sound, the scraping of metal filing cabinets, the distant hum of the fluorescent lights, made her jump. She realized she could not continue working the same way. She needed more precautions. She began making copies of everything. Hospital records, adoption files, financial documents, newspaper clippings. She hid them in a hatbox in her apartment, under floorboards, even in the lining of her coat. She could not risk a visit from the wrong person again. Margaret also began preparing questions for the women she wanted to interview. Mothers, midwives, nurses, anyone who might remember what had happened decades ago. She knew these interviews would be delicate, dangerous, and emotionally intense. She had to approach carefully. Her first planned interview was with the family of Ruth Ann Jackson, whose hospital records matched the adoption of a boy listed as European. Ruth Ann had been admitted in 1928. The boy had been adopted by the Ashford family. Margaret knew that gathering this testimony would confirm her worst suspicions. She arrived on a sweltering July morning at a small house on Beaufane Street. A woman answered the door, older, lined with years of work and worry. Margaret explained her identity cautiously. She was an archivist, researching historical hospital records, and she had found references to the woman's mother. The woman's eyes narrowed. She invited Margaret inside, but her voice was tight. "You're asking about things that happened a long time ago. Dangerous things. Why now?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I want the truth to be remembered. I want the mothers and children to be acknowledged. I am not here to accuse anyone. I am here to listen." The woman nodded slowly. She spoke of Ruth Ann's pregnancy, the hospital visit, and the devastating news that her child had supposedly died. She recalled nurses telling Ruth Ann she must rest and forget the trauma. She recalled her mother's pain, the whispered fears in the kitchen at night, the grief that never left her family. Margaret listened carefully, taking notes, confirming dates and names with the documents she had copied. Every word matched the ledger. Every memory confirmed the hospital records, the adoptions, and the payments she had traced. By late afternoon, Margaret left the house. She had confirmed another case. Another stolen child. Another devastated mother. She knew there were dozens more waiting. Back at her apartment, Margaret locked the door and sat in the dim light. She had begun to understand the scope. Hundreds of children, decades of theft, families manipulated, mothers silenced, and all orchestrated under the guise of respectability and charity. And now the warnings were real. Someone had come to her door. Someone wanted her to stop. Margaret realized she had a choice. She could leave, walk away, pretend she never saw the records, pretend she never read the ledgers, pretend she never asked the questions. She could be safe, she could be quiet, but she could not, she would not. The people who had stolen these children had destroyed lives. They had relied on silence, fear, and the power of their wealth. Margaret had the evidence, the documents, the testimonies, the connections. She was beginning to see the network that had protected the operation for 20 years. And she knew she had to expose it. The visitor at her door had proven one thing. Powerful people were willing to act to protect the secret. Margaret was willing to risk everything to uncover it. That night, she sat by the window, looking out at the streets of Charleston. The shadows felt thicker than ever. She knew the danger was real. But she also knew the stakes. Mothers and children had waited decades for someone to tell the truth. Margaret Hayes would be that person. If this story has captured your attention, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 6 reveals a shocking discovery about the role of social clubs, private charities, and how deep the network protecting these crimes really ran. I can continue immediately with Part 6, where Margaret uncovers the secret elite network of Charleston families and institutions that kept the child trafficking operation hidden for decades. Do you want me to proceed with Part 6? Part 6: The Web of Secrets. Some webs are invisible. Some threads are so tightly woven that no one dares to pull on them. Margaret Hayes had just realized she was standing at the center of one. By July 1951, Margaret had confirmed dozens of cases where babies had been stolen from their mothers and recorded as white for adoption by Charleston's elite families. She had copies of hospital records, adoption papers, and financial ledgers. She had spoken to Evelyn Porter's brother and the family of Ruth Ann Jackson. But she knew documents and testimony were only the beginning. The truth, she suspected, ran far deeper. Margaret returned to her apartment one evening, notebook in hand. She laid out all the families she had traced: the Cunninghams, the Ashfords, the Prescotts, the Beaumonts. She studied the names, addresses, clubs, and church affiliations. Connections began to appear like constellations on her map. Families intermarried. Families did business together. They belonged to the same country clubs, attended the same Episcopal churches, sent their children to the same private schools. They were powerful, and they protected each other. She began focusing on the charities. Street. Catherine's Adoption Society had been her first clue, but the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, Webb's secret organization, was just the tip of the iceberg. Margaret found references to other foundations and societies that had provided donations, grants, or advisory support for child welfare. Some were publicly recognized, others seemed to exist only on paper. She realized something terrifying. These were not isolated incidents. They were coordinated. A network had been built to identify light-skinned babies born to black mothers, remove them, falsify records, and place them with wealthy white families. Hospitals, adoption societies, charities, churches, social clubs, and elite families all played a role. Margaret needed more evidence, and she needed to understand the mechanism. She returned to Charleston County Hospital archives, poring over financial ledgers. She traced every payment from 1922 to 1940 related to child welfare. Donations flowed to Webb's Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, to St. Catherine's Adoption Society, and even to unnamed charitable foundations. Most payments were described vaguely, often as consulting fees, administrative costs, or welfare services. Margaret had begun keeping a separate ledger for herself. She labeled it the network ledger. Each page recorded families, hospitals, charities, and intermediaries. She traced connections between families who adopted multiple children. Some adoptive families repeatedly used the same agency. Others had children with the same doctor listed on hospital records. Webb's name appeared again and again. By the end of the first week in August, Margaret began identifying patterns. Certain doctors and nurses repeatedly facilitated these adoptions. Certain midwives and attendants appeared in hospital logs. Certain families received children faster than normal, sometimes within days. The operation was efficient, deliberate, and protected by respectability. Margaret decided she needed to see the network in action. She attended a luncheon at a social club she had discovered on her research. It was an Episcopal Women's Guild meeting, held at a private hall downtown. She dressed in her best navy blue suit, hair neat, demeanor cautious. She listened and observed. The conversations were polite, but the undertones were unmistakable. Families discussed children, adoptions, marriages, social events. Occasionally, phrases like special placement or timely arrival were mentioned casually. Margaret's pulse quickened. She realized the euphemisms were deliberate. People who understood knew exactly what was being referred to. Others, like church members or newcomers, did not. She discreetly took notes. Names, dates, phrases, gestures. Everything mattered. Every casual remark was a clue. She knew she could not confront anyone directly. Not yet. She needed proof. She needed the documents that connected the words to actions. At the office the next day, Margaret traced connections she had seen at the luncheon back to hospital records. The dates matched. Children were placed with the same families, sometimes within days of birth. Payments had been made to the same organizations. The network was not only real but operational for decades. Margaret realized she had underestimated the scale. Hundreds of children, families interlinked, agencies, hospitals, and social clubs working together. All under the public guise of charity and morality. The depth of coordination was staggering. And the implications were terrifying. She also realized she had enemies. Someone had already come to her door. Someone had left warnings. Someone had followed her on the streets. The network was still alive in 1951, and they were watching her. Margaret knew she could not act recklessly. She began organizing her files in layers. Copies went into locked drawers at the office. Originals were hidden in her apartment. Key evidence was memorized. She created a detailed map linking every family, every agency, every doctor, and every payment. She studied it daily, memorizing patterns, connections, and vulnerabilities. Her mind returned again and again to the mothers. Evelyn Porter, Ruth Ann Jackson. Their grief was tangible. It had lasted decades. And it would last until someone told the truth. Margaret understood that if she failed, the network would continue to silence the victims and protect the perpetrators. She began planning her next steps. She needed more testimony. She needed to find others willing to speak. She needed to uncover every hidden record before anyone could stop her. Margaret also understood that exposure would change everything. Families who had benefited from stolen children would be implicated. Charities and hospitals would face scandal. Powerful individuals could lose their social standing, money, and influence. She knew the risks. She knew someone might try to scare her, threaten her, or worse. But Margaret Hayes was committed. She had been an archivist, cataloging history. Now she was an investigator, a historian of crimes long hidden. Every document, every conversation, every payment was a thread in the web. And she was determined to follow each one. The network had power. It had wealth. It had secrecy. But Margaret had time, evidence, courage, and determination. She had seen the patterns. She had heard the stories. And she had begun to piece together a truth that could change Charleston forever. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 7 reveals Margaret's first breakthrough in identifying a living member of the network and the chilling confrontation that follows. I can continue immediately with Part 7, where Margaret uncovers a living insider in the network and faces a tense confrontation that raises the stakes dramatically. Do you want me to continue with Part 7? Part 7: The Insider. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some people will kill to protect them. Margaret Hayes had felt the shadows long before she understood the danger. Now she was about to meet the person who had kept Charleston's darkest truth alive for decades. It began with a letter, typed, unsigned, slipped under her office door one morning. The message was brief. Meet me at the Magnolia Street Cafe at noon. Come alone. Bring your notes. No one else. The handwriting was careful, precise, almost polite. But Margaret knew it was a summons. A test. She stared at the note for a long time. Could she trust it? Could she ignore it? She had been following hundreds of stolen children through ledgers, hospital records, and adoption papers. She had spoken to family members of mothers who had lost their children. She had traced payments to the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, to St. Catherine's Adoption Society, to private donors. She had felt eyes on her, warnings at her door. And now someone wanted her to meet in person. Margaret prepared carefully. She memorized the notes she would take, packed copies of key records, and left her apartment carrying only what she could hide under her coat. She drove through Charleston, eyes on the streets, alert for anyone following her. She parked a block away and walked to the cafe. The cafe was quiet, a small place with faded green booths and a smell of coffee and baked bread. She slid into a corner booth and waited. The clock ticked slowly. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then she saw him. He was older, probably in his 70s, dressed in a gray suit, tie slightly loosened. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was a weariness in his shoulders. He scanned the room, then approached her booth. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," she said, trying to steady her nerves. "Call me Mr. Langston," he said, sitting across from her. He placed a small leather briefcase on the table. Margaret noted the tremor in his hands, the slight hesitation before he spoke. "I know what you are looking for," he said finally. "And I know why you are here." Margaret leaned forward. "You were involved." "I was," he admitted. "But not the way you think. I helped maintain records. I kept things running smoothly. I never wanted anyone hurt. I never wanted anyone to know. But I had no choice. When you start asking questions, people notice. People in Charleston notice." Margaret's heart pounded. She had expected denial, threats, or lies. But here was someone admitting involvement, someone willing to speak, cautiously. "You know what happened to those babies," she said. "You know the mothers. You know the families. You know everything." "I know a lot," Langston said. "I kept files. I kept lists. I made sure the adoptions looked legitimate. Some of those babies, they were taken from mothers who were told their child had died. And yes, many went to families who would never have qualified for legal adoption. But it was organized. It was controlled. It was supposed to be discreet." Margaret gritted her teeth. Supposed to be discreet. These were children stolen from their mothers. "You call that discretion?" Langston looked at her, sadness in his eyes. "I lived in Charleston. I worked for Dr. Webb. Everyone did what was expected. You were not born in Charleston. You do not know how much people fear consequences here. Those mothers had no voice. Those families had influence. If anyone questioned us, it could ruin their lives. My job was to keep the system running without anyone knowing the truth. That was all I could do." Margaret exhaled slowly. She felt a mixture of relief and revulsion. Relief that someone would talk. Revulsion at the scale of the deception. "Can you show me records?" she asked. "Names, dates, payments, adoptions. Anything that can prove what happened." Langston opened the briefcase. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each containing copies of ledgers, adoption files, and hospital records. Pages with birth dates, names of mothers and children, notes on adoptions, even internal correspondence discussing payments and donations. Margaret felt her hands shake as she opened the first envelope. The handwriting, the dates, the names matched the patterns she had been tracing for months. This was the evidence she needed. The living proof. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. Because someone has to know, Langston said quietly. I am old. I cannot change what happened. I cannot face the families. But maybe you can. Maybe you can finally give the truth a chance. Be careful. You are dealing with powerful people. Some of them still walk these streets. Some still influence the hospitals, the churches, the charities. They will not let the past be exposed without a fight. Margaret nodded. She understood the stakes. The network she had been tracing was not just history. It was alive. The families, the social clubs, the hospitals, they still had influence in Charleston in 1951. Exposure could bring danger, threats, violence, maybe even worse. She spent the next 2 hours going through Langston's files, photographing pages, taking notes, and cross-referencing with the documents she already had. The evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of babies, stolen from their mothers, recorded as white, placed with wealthy families. Hundreds of payments funneled through charities and agencies, all connected to Dr. Harrison Webb and his associates. When she left the cafe, Margaret's mind was racing. She had evidence. She had testimony. She had proof that could stand up in court, or at least before investigators. But she also had enemies who would do anything to protect the secret. Langston had warned her. She needed a plan. She needed caution. She needed allies she could trust. But above all, she needed to continue. The mothers, the children, the stolen lives, they deserved the truth. Margaret Hayes understood one thing more clearly than ever. Some secrets survive because people fear them. Some secrets survive because people enforce them. But the truth has a way of clawing its way out, and Margaret had just become the person holding the light. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 8 reveals Margaret's first legal action, a terrifying confrontation with a family implicated in the network, and the lengths to which Charleston's elite will go to protect themselves. I can continue immediately with Part 8, where Margaret begins to confront the families and faces direct danger from the network. Do you want me to continue with Part 8? Part 8 The confrontation. Some truths are dangerous. Some lies are deadly. Margaret Hayes had spent months piecing together a puzzle so dark that she could hardly believe it existed. Hundreds of stolen children, mothers silenced, wealthy families protected, hospitals, charities, social clubs, and doctors all complicit. And now she was ready to confront the people who had benefited from decades of theft. It started with a letter she had sent, carefully worded, requesting a meeting with a family she had traced in her research. The Ashfords. Wealthy, influential, long established in Charleston society. Their adopted son had been taken from Ruth Ann Jackson in 1928, a boy officially recorded as white. Margaret's notes and documents proved it. She had rehearsed every word. She knew the risks. This was not just a historical inquiry. This was accusation. And in Charleston, in 1951, accusations like hers could ruin reputations, careers, and lives. Margaret arrived at the Ashford mansion on a Thursday morning. The house was imposing, brick, 2 stories with columns at the entrance. She rang the bell, her heart hammering. A butler answered, expression neutral, eyes sharp. I have an appointment with Mr. Theodore Ashford, she said. He nodded and led her into a drawing room. Plush furniture, polished floors, the scent of expensive perfume and cigars. Theodore Ashford entered shortly after. Older, distinguished, with silver hair and an air of authority. He shook her hand, a polite smile masking suspicion. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I understand you have questions about the family. How can I help you? Margaret set her briefcase on the table. She opened it carefully and spread a few documents before him. Hospital records, adoption papers, financial ledgers. Names and dates perfectly aligned. These documents, Margaret said quietly, show that your adopted son was taken from Ruth Ann Jackson. He was born at Charleston County Hospital in 1928, admitted under her name, but the birth certificate listed him as white, with no parents. The child was adopted by your family within days. Payments were made through the Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, organized by Dr. Harrison Webb. I have testimony from family members confirming the mothers never saw their children again. This was deliberate. This was a systematic operation. Ashford's face did not change. His hands rested on the arms of his chair. He studied the documents with calm detachment. "You are accusing my family of theft and fraud," he said slowly. "Do you understand the weight of that accusation?" "I understand," Margaret said. "I am presenting evidence. I am giving you a chance to respond. But I will not ignore what I have found. Hundreds of children were stolen. Mothers were deceived. Families like yours benefited from it. The documents speak for themselves." Ashford leaned back. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Hayes, you are brave. Or foolish. You have no idea how dangerous this line of inquiry is. Charleston is a city built on appearances, on respectability. People like my family, drive. Webb, the doctors, the agencies, the charities, they did what they thought was necessary. They protected the children, they protected the families. Your evidence may be correct, but your timing is reckless." Margaret's throat tightened. Protected. These mothers were lied to. These children were stolen. You cannot justify this. No one can. Ashford's eyes hardened. You are threatening people who have influence. People who will stop at nothing to protect the past. Do you understand what that means? I do, Margaret said. But the mothers and the children deserve justice. They deserve the truth, and I will find a way to give it to them. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Be careful, Mrs. Hayes. You are walking in dangerous territory. There are people who would rather silence you than face exposure. You may think you have allies, but the network is powerful, and they do not forgive inquiries like yours. Margaret left the mansion with her head high but her heart racing. The warning was clear. She had evidence, she had testimony, but she also had enemies who would not hesitate to protect their secrets. Over the following days, Margaret worked methodically. She organized all her files, making duplicates and hiding them in multiple locations. She contacted lawyers discreetly, preparing for the legal battle she knew was coming. She also began mapping every connection in the network, noting vulnerabilities, identifying patterns of influence and power. One evening, she returned to her apartment to find her door ajar. Panic gripped her. She entered cautiously. Nothing appeared to be missing. Papers were untouched, but the warning was unmistakable. Someone had been inside. Someone watching. Someone signaling that she was treading dangerous ground. Margaret did not sleep that night. She reviewed every document, every note, every testimony she had collected. She knew that the Ashfords were not the only family she needed to confront. The Prescotts, the Cunninghams, the Beaumonts, every family linked to stolen children, would have to be held accountable. And she knew that some of them still had influence in Charleston's hospitals, churches, and social clubs. They had the means to protect themselves. They had power. They had wealth. But Margaret had something they could not control, the truth. By the end of August, she had gathered enough evidence to approach authorities, but she also knew that going public without preparation could be suicidal. The network had been built on secrecy and protection. Exposure would provoke resistance, threats, and possibly violence. Margaret Hayes understood the stakes. She had crossed the line. The families, the charities, the hospitals, they knew she was investigating. She had seen the warnings. She had met the insider, Langston, and received the proof. And now, the confrontation had made one thing clear: she could not turn back. If she failed, the mothers and children would remain forgotten. If she succeeded, she would shake Charleston to its core. And she would face enemies willing to do anything to stop her. Margaret's resolve hardened. She would move forward. She would gather the remaining testimonies. She would document every stolen child, every family, every payment, every lie. The network was powerful, but it was not infallible. And the truth, once revealed, could not be silenced. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 9 uncovers Margaret's legal battle, shocking betrayals, and the first public exposure of Charleston's hidden network of stolen children. I can continue immediately with Part 9, where Margaret begins the legal battle, faces betrayal, and brings the network into public scrutiny, raising the stakes to a shocking level. Do you want me to continue with Part 9? Part 9 The Reckoning. Truth has a weight. It presses against your chest, demanding attention, demanding action. For Margaret Hayes, the weight had become unbearable. The network she had uncovered stretched across decades, spanning hospitals, charities, elite families, and social institutions. Hundreds of children had been stolen from their mothers, rewritten on paper, and handed to families who could pass them as white. Now, she was about to bring it into the light. It began with a lawyer. Margaret had reached out to a small but reputable firm in Charleston, one that specialized in civil rights cases. She met with Mr. James Whitaker in a quiet office downtown. Whitaker listened as Margaret laid out the evidence: hospital records, adoption papers, financial ledgers, and the testimonies of surviving mothers and family members. "This is extraordinary," Whitaker said finally. "And dangerous. The families, the agencies, the hospitals, they are powerful. But if your evidence is accurate, we can proceed carefully. We can file suits. We can bring this into public view. But you must understand, Mrs. Hayes, you are not only challenging history. You are challenging people who will fight tooth and nail to protect themselves." Margaret nodded. She had known the risks from the beginning. Threats had been subtle at first. A shadow outside her apartment, a letter slipped under her office door, a phone call with no one speaking. Now, the danger was real. They began with Ruth Ann Jackson's case. Whitaker filed a civil suit against the Ashford family, demanding acknowledgement of the stolen child and reparations. Margaret provided testimony, records, and Langston's evidence. It was meticulous, airtight, impossible to ignore. News of the case spread quietly at first. Charleston's elite whispered in clubs and churches. Lawyers and private investigators were mobilized. Threats began to arrive, subtle at first, then more direct. Margaret received an anonymous note slipped into her coat pocket at the office. It read simply, "Stop. You know nothing about what you are stirring." But Margaret did not stop. She organized a press conference to accompany the legal filings. The story was explosive. Children had been stolen from their mothers, officially recorded as white, placed with wealthy families, and the operation had been protected by doctors, charities, and social institutions. The press coverage was immediate. Headlines splashed across Charleston newspapers and then spread to national outlets. Outrage was swift. Public opinion was divided. Some were shocked. Some defended the families. Some refused to believe the allegations. Margaret faced hostility as well as support. Friends warned her. Colleagues whispered caution. And yet, mothers came forward. Evelyn Porter's family spoke to reporters. Ruth Ann Jackson's children shared their pain. Other women, now elderly, came forward to testify about the babies they had lost, the lies they had been told, the children they had never seen again. Meanwhile, the families involved mobilized. Lawyers, public relations teams, and private investigators flooded the courts and the press. Some families admitted nothing. Some denied everything. Some tried to smear Margaret herself, questioning her motives, her credibility, even her sanity. The courtroom became a battlefield. Margaret Hayes sat quietly, watching as evidence was presented. Hospital records matched adoption papers. Payments to charities traced to Dr. Harrison Webb's bureau. Testimony from mothers corroborated the documents. Langston's hidden files were introduced. The network could no longer hide. But it was not without cost. Threats escalated. Margaret's apartment was broken into. Files were rifled through. Her car was vandalized. She received phone calls in the middle of the night. People she had trusted suddenly became distant. The network was fighting back, using wealth and influence to intimidate, to delay, to discredit. Despite the pressure, the truth began to emerge. Families were forced to acknowledge the adoptions. Hospitals had to release more records. Charities faced scrutiny. The public was enraged. Questions about morality, justice, and accountability flooded every forum. Margaret had expected resistance, but she had not anticipated the scale of denial and complicity. In one hearing, an attorney representing a prominent family challenged Langston's testimony. "This man is decades removed from events," he argued. "He has personal bias. He cannot be relied upon as a credible witness." Margaret stood. She spoke calmly, her voice clear and measured. "Langston kept records that were hidden for decades. Those records align perfectly with hospital and adoption documents. The patterns are undeniable. This is not conjecture. This is evidence. And it proves that children were taken without their mother's consent, and records were falsified to hide the truth. The judge, an older man with a reputation for fairness, reviewed the files. He asked pointed questions. He requested verification of every claim. Margaret provided it. The evidence was overwhelming. The weight of decades of deception could not be ignored. By the end of September, Charleston was in upheaval. Families once untouchable faced public scrutiny. Some quietly apologized. Others resigned from social and charitable positions. Hospitals and adoption agencies instituted internal reviews. The Carolina Children's Welfare Bureau, long dissolved, became a symbol of corruption, deceit, and exploitation. Margaret Hayes, meanwhile, felt the toll. Sleepless nights, constant vigilance, fear for her safety, and the emotional weight of confronting stolen lives. But she also felt vindicated. Mothers finally had acknowledgement. Some children, now adults, were tracing their origins. Some families were confronting the truth of what had been done in their name. And yet, even as she watched the first wave of justice unfold, Margaret knew the network's shadows would linger. Some secrets would never be fully revealed. Some families would quietly protect themselves. Some mothers would never find closure. But for the first time in decades, the truth had a chance. Margaret understood one thing clearly. Truth was powerful, and those who dared to reveal it could change the course of history. Charleston would never be the same, and neither would she. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Part 10, the final chapter, reveals the ultimate consequences of Margaret's investigation, the resolution for the mothers and children, and the chilling legacy of Charleston's hidden network of stolen children. I can continue immediately with Part 10, the final chapter, where Margaret uncovers the final pieces of the network, the public reckoning occurs, and the story concludes with justice, horror, and lasting consequences. Do you want me to continue with Part 10? Part 10, the truth unveiled. Some truths cannot be contained. Some lies demand exposure. Margaret Hayes had spent months unearthing Charleston's darkest secret. She had followed documents, traced payments, mapped networks, and gathered testimonies from mothers who had been silenced for decades. She had faced threats, intimidation, and isolation. Now, everything was coming to a head. It began with a final piece of evidence. Margaret had tracked a series of letters between Harrison Webb and a prominent socialite, detailing arrangements for infants to be placed with specific families. The handwriting was careful, coded, but unmistakable. Names, dates, and amounts confirmed what she had already discovered. Hundreds of children had been stolen, and the letters revealed the deliberate orchestration behind each placement. Margaret organized a press conference in downtown Charleston. It was held in a small auditorium filled with journalists, lawyers, and mothers who had come forward. Cameras flashed. Microphones were set up. Margaret stood at the podium, feeling the weight of the room, the history, and the lives she represented. She began with a simple statement. For decades, children were stolen from their mothers in Charleston. Hospital records were falsified. Adoption agencies collaborated with influential families. Mothers were told their children had died. Children were placed with families who could pay, families who could pass them as white. Today, the truth will be acknowledged, and those responsible, past and present, will be held accountable. Questions came fast. Reporters asked about evidence, about families, about motivations. Margaret presented the ledgers, the adoption papers, the hospital records, and Langston's files. She told the stories of mothers like Evelyn Porter and Ruth Ann Jackson, of children whose lives had been shaped by theft, deceit, and lies. The response was immediate and explosive. Charleston's elite tried to downplay the scandal. Some admitted guilt quietly. Others attacked Margaret, calling her claims exaggerated or baseless. But the documents were indisputable. The public could see the patterns. Payments traced through charities, adoptions arranged in secrecy, mothers silenced and children erased from their history. Legal action followed swiftly. Families faced civil suits, hospitals were forced to release records, and adoption agencies came under investigation. Some families issued public apologies. Some sought reconciliation with children who had spent decades wondering about their origins. Others remained defiant, maintaining wealth and influence but forever marked by exposure. Margaret also ensured that surviving mothers were acknowledged and compensated where possible. Community organizations stepped forward to help reconnect families and provide counseling for those affected. Newspapers and national media covered the story extensively. What had been hidden for decades was now public knowledge. Charleston could no longer ignore its history. Margaret reflected on what she had uncovered. The network had been efficient, cruel, and protected by authority. Dr. Harrison Webb had used his reputation as a pediatrician and his connections in the social and charitable world to orchestrate a decades-long system of theft and deceit. Wealth, race, and power had created a perfect shield for these crimes. But the human element had persisted. Mothers remembered. Survivors came forward. Records, hidden for years, had survived. And Margaret Hayes had risked everything to bring the truth to light. Her meticulous work, her courage, and her refusal to be silenced had broken the chain of secrecy. The story did not end neatly. Some families refused to reconcile. Some mothers had passed away without knowing the fate of their children. Some children remained unaware of their origins. The trauma and injustice could never be fully erased. But the truth existed now, undeniable and public, and that alone was a victory. Margaret left the press conference that day exhausted but resolute. She had uncovered Charleston's secret, challenged the powerful, and given a voice to the mothers and children who had been silenced. She knew that history would remember her work, that future generations would study the events she had exposed, and that the stolen children, now adults, could finally trace their past. Walking through the streets of Charleston that evening, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was known. Sorrow for the decades of pain, loss, and injustice. She had carried the weight of hundreds of lives, and though she had exposed the network, the scars left behind would never fully heal. Margaret Hayes had become a guardian of history, a witness to injustice, and a crusader for truth. The city of Charleston would never be the same. And neither would the lives of those who had been stolen, silenced, or displaced. Their stories would endure. Their voices would be heard. Their existence could no longer be denied. And as she looked out over the harbor at dusk, the water shimmering under the fading sunlight, Margaret felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced danger, confronted powerful forces, and revealed a truth that could not be hidden. She had done what history demanded, and she had given a voice to the forgotten. If this story has moved you, if it has shocked you, if it has made you question the history you thought you knew, subscribe to the channel, share this video with others, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Remember the mothers, remember the children, and remember the courage it takes to uncover the truth. History can be dark, but the truth will always shine. The full 10-part series is now complete. Each part builds the suspense, horror, and historical drama, bringing the story to its intense and satisfying conclusion.